I had never been to an evangelical church, and so I didn't know what to expect. And it was just a plain auditorium, which I appreciated. And I walked in and it was like the Christian worship music was playing. I cringed at that because I was like, oh my gosh, Christian music. And then I was like, wait, it's not bad.
Yeah.
And I liked it. And I took a seat. I found a seat by myself near the front, and the pastor came out and started preaching on Romans chapter 7.
Oh, yeah.
And
good. So good.
That pastor actually was at the coffee shop as well. But he just kind of like walked by the table next to us and said hi to them and left. So I had seen him already. So when he came out to start preaching, I was like, that's the guy from the coffee shop. Like in my head, I was just like, wow, this is the same guy. So he was preaching, and why I always say this, while he was preaching, everything he was saying was resonating as truth in my mind, in my heart, and I didn't understand why. I was like, why? What is happening? I was riveted to the sermon. I was hanging on every word of his, and I was just so blown away. I was like, what is he saying? He was preaching for an hour. You know, his sermons are an hour long, and I didn't want him to stop talking. I'm like, just keep talking. And then after the sermon, he said there's people on the side of the auditorium who are on the prayer ministry if you want prayer for anything, blah, blah, blah. And then there's another half hour of worship music. And so I had this moment of like, do I go over and ask for prayer? If I do, like the people who invited me here might be watching me and it's embarrassing. But I was just like, I'm going to do this. I'm here. I'm already in the door. I'm just going to go. So I went over and asked this guy for prayer. I said, hey, I don't know what I believe, but I'm here. And he said, let me pray for you. And he prayed for me. It seemed very powerful. And I went back to my seat, sat down. Everyone else was standing up and singing for the next 25 minutes, worshiping. As soon as I sat down, the Holy Spirit just like completely flooded my body and my mind and my soul. And in that moment, God revealed himself to me. It was a road to Damascus kind of moment. God was like, I'm God. Jesus is my son. Heaven is real. Hell is real. The Bible is true. Welcome to my kingdom. And I started like water was just like flying out of my eyes. Like I was bawling hysterically because I had just met Jesus, the King of the universe. And I was crying over the conviction of sin, but also over the joy of knowing that God exists. And meeting Jesus and finally knowing the meaning of life. Like that's a huge deal. And obviously, because when you don't know the meaning of life, it's a heavy burden to bear because you're like, what am I doing here? And so I finally knew where I came from, what I'm doing here and where I was going. And I was just crying and crying and crying and crying and crying and doubled over. And the service ends and I get in my car, come home, and the same thing, it happens again. I get into bed and God's like, let me show you some more of my glory. And I just immediately burst into tears again. And I was like, ah. And I jumped out of my bed and in the middle of my bedroom, I said, God, you have my whole life. I'm done. I'm yours. That's it. And I knew I was all in. And I knew in that moment that homosexual behavior was a sin. I knew that it was no longer a part of my life. I knew it was not my identity. I knew that dating guys was no longer a part of my future. I always say this, but I was like, I had just met Jesus. So I'm like, I'm going with that guy. A good riddance to those old guys. Like I'm going with Jesus. And I don't care what it involves. Like I am all in. I don't care if I never touch another human being in my life. I'm all in for this.
Wow.
Like this is amazing. And that was 13 years ago.
That's incredible. I love that. You know what's interesting, Beckett? Let me get your thoughts on this because I have a friend, Jen. I interviewed her on my channel not too long ago. I was talking about her before we got on. And I'll leave that interview in the description as well, along with a link to your book. And the interesting thing is this, is that you and Jen don't know each other. You don't even know who I'm talking about right now. But what you just expressed to me about the Holy Spirit, and you're like, I know it's a sin. Take everything, God. I will, I am all in, you know, if this is who you are, I want all of that. I will give up any same experience. And it's so interesting that the Holy Spirit does that. The Holy Spirit convicts.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's, you were so drawn to that. And oh, I love that. It's such a good testimony to how the Spirit works and where it leads into truth to who he is. Now you had that, and I'm sure it was a journey, because I'm sure people watching right now, one of the things that they ask and wonder about is, okay, you're a gay man though, you know, like, how does that work? How did you not struggle with what the Bible said about homosexuality? Because what people try to do is they try to toe that line, right? Yeah. And again, I have a lot to say about progressive Christianity, but why was that appealing to you? What if it was Mormons that came in, right? Or Jehovah's Witnesses or Buddhists, right? What was it about that moment in particular, looking back now, that you see that was orchestrated for God to use in your life, and that was appealing? Would you have found appeal if it were like some other religious people that came in that say weren't Christians?
No, because I've always been sensitive to the truth. So when
discernment,
and I think Calvin says this in his Institutes, I think, but it's like when a baby knows when something is sour or sweet. It's just, there's no. And so it's like I like that. Yeah. When I read the Bible, like right after I got saved, I of course read the Bible cover to cover, and I was just like, I couldn't believe how every single word in the book of Numbers, like how every single word was true. I was like, what? This is true. This is true. This is all true. This is true. And it was like a perfect symphony, and every note was perfect. And there wasn't a false note in this book. And I've always been very perceptive about false notes. Just with people in general, or anything in general, really. And when I read the Bible, I was like, I can't believe this is true. And I can't believe that I'm now a part of this story of redemption. I'm a part of this whole story of this book. Mm-hmm. And so what I don't understand is why anyone who claims to be a follower of Christ would try to figure out a way to just kind of do the least amount they can to sort of get tipped into heaven, but still be able to sin. Like, so, I mean, I'm just going to hold on to this thing, this homosexual behavior, and I'm going to say that God affirms it, because I'm like, why in the world would you do that? Eternity is at stake.
Yeah.
This is like not, this is like real. Okay. So why in the world, it's like Francis Chan once said, if the Bible said all Chinese men have to stand on their head 8 hours a day, he would do it. The Bible is so clear on this issue of and we could get into that if we want, but it's so clear on homosexual behavior. It's like, I of course am going to be obedient to that. And I always say that I find so much joy in obedience because before I was a Christian, I was all over the place. I didn't know what was right or wrong. And I just found myself in so many situations where I'm like, well, I guess this is fine to do. I mean, to have an affair with someone who's in a relationship, I mean, I guess it's fine. But I love the boundaries that God set up in the Bible. I love his sexual ethic, that sex is to be expressed within the covenant of a marriage between one man and one woman for life. And because he knows he knows how human beings flourish the best, and that's how we flourish the best. And anything outside of that, premarital sex, extramarital sex, homosexual sex, always leads to pain, destruction, eternal destruction, if it's not repented of, and et cetera, et cetera. It always leads to bad stuff. And so God knows what he's doing. And I love having these guardrails. I love having these boundaries in my life of like, okay, I know not to touch that hot stove. Now I know. And rather than it being a burden, it's actually so liberating to know what the boundaries are.